The wind howled through the cliffs, a frigid scream that cut deep into Bradley's bones. He and Canyon had finally arrived at the base of Cougar's Fang, the place that had haunted him for a decade. A hidden path, shrouded by a frozen waterfall, led them to a steel door, unmarked, weathered, and ajar. It shouldn't have been. Gunpowder. Fresh. It wafted out from the darkness, beyond familiar and unnerving. Bradley's heartbeat quickened as Canyon's eyes locked onto the crack in the door body taut with tension. Something was waiting inside. But what and who was still a mystery. Bradley's breath hung in the air like smoke as he stepped closer, the ice crunching beneath his boots. Canyon stayed at his side, the dog's hackles raised body stiff with unease. The door's faint creak echoed in the stillness, and Bradley's hand hovered over the cold metal, the chill seeping into his bones. His mind raced. This door was never meant to be opened. And yet here it was, betraying a secret that had been buried for 10 years. He pushed it gently, the hinges whispering a warning. Gunpowder. It hit him like a punch to the gut, sharp and recent. His father's scent, mixed with the acrid trace of violence, was unmistakable. A soft woof sounded behind him, Canyon's low growl vibrating through the air. Bradley took a slow breath. He was about to cross a threshold that might unravel everything he thought he knew. Tom was dead. Wasn't he? The dark room beckoned, promising answers and maybe more questions than he was ready to face. What had his father left behind? The wind howled through the cliffs of Cougar's Fang, fierce and untamed, as though the mountains themselves were alive and angry. It cut into Bradley's face with brutal efficiency, sharp as a blade, biting through the worn fabric of his jacket and seeping into his bones. He pulled his collar higher, his gloved hands shoved deep into his pockets. The storm was relentless, as it always was in this part of Idaho, but Bradley had long since learned to move through it without feeling it. Behind him, Canyon padded silently through the thick snow, his coat, a sleek mixture of silver gray and white. The German Shepherd moved with the quiet dignity of a retired soldier, his every movement purposeful, calculated. No longer a working dog, Canyon had settled into a quieter life, but his instincts were as sharp as ever. They had both seen enough to know that the world didn't let go easily. Neither of them had. The ranch, nestled in the remote corner of Solitude Creek, sat in a pocket of isolation, surrounded by towering pines and the jagged peaks of the Sawtooth Range. From the front porch, the world stretched out in all directions, a vast, endless expanse of snow and stone. The cold here wasn't just a fact of life. It was the defining feature of existence, a constant companion that buried everything in its icy grip. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, bending under the weight of the winter storm. Bradley didn't need to look up to see the distant ridge of Cougar's Fang looming like a silent sentinel in the far distance. He knew it was there, even if it was shrouded by the blizzard. The storm had a way of swallowing the land whole, erasing everything in its path, but Bradley had spent most of his life here. The storm didn't scare him, not anymore. He had come to respect the mountain, the wind, and the cold, but they were just part of the landscape, just part of his life. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching through the deep snow. Canyon followed closely behind his paws, barely making a sound on the frozen ground. The path to the barn was familiar, worn down by years of use. It was the path Bradley had taken 1,000 times before, but today it felt different. Everything did. He could feel it in the air, the weight of something shifting, of a story that had been buried for too long, threatening to resurface. The barn was only 100 yards from the house, but in this kind of storm, it might as well have been a mile. The snow had already begun to pile up against the weathered building, the corrugated tin roof sagging slightly under the weight. The structure had stood since the 1972, a relic of a time when things were simpler. When the world hadn't turned into a place that wanted to take everything from him, Bradley's father had built the barn with his own hands alongside everything else on the ranch. It was where Tom had stored his old equipment, his tools, junk mostly. But to Bradley, it was more than just a barn. It was a symbol of a time before the weight of the world had fallen on his shoulders, before the accident, before the silence. Canyon's low woof broke Bradley from his thoughts. The dog's eyes were fixed on him, unwavering, waiting for his next move. Bradley looked down at the German Shepherd. The dog's fur was thick, built for this kind of cold. He wasn't just a pet. Canyon had been with him for 5 years now, a constant companion, a silent presence at his side. They had both come back from the war, both scarred in their own ways. Canyon had been injured in the line of duty, his service cut short, but their bond had remained. Canyon had been Bradley's anchor when everything else had fallen apart. Bradley reached down and scratched the dog's ear. Canyon responded with a soft growl, not from aggression but from the comfort of being close to his partner. They didn't need words. They never had. Their communication was instinctual, forged through years of working side by side. The storm picked up the wind howling in their ears as they made their way to the barn. The air had a biting quality to it, colder than the usual winter winds, and Bradley felt it press against him with an almost physical weight. The familiar sounds of the ranch, the creak of wood, the low groan of the barn, felt distant now, as if the world had shifted in ways he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just the storm. It wasn't just the wind. Something was different. Bradley reached the barn and paused for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. His hands were numb, his fingers stiff, but he didn't notice it. The barn was quiet, too quiet. He could hear the wind, but not much else. No animals, no rustling of straw, nothing. The air felt wrong. It felt like the calm before something terrible, something inevitable. "Let's check the roof," Boy Bradley said softly, his voice hoarse from disuse. Canyon's ears flicked forward in alert. Bradley pushed open the barn's door with a groan, the hinges protesting against the weight of the snow. The inside was dim, lit only by the weak light from the storm outside, filtering through cracks in the wood. Bradley stepped inside his boots, scraping the floor, as he made his way to the far corner where his father's tools were scattered in disarray. The place had once been filled with purpose. It had once been where Tom had worked tirelessly, mending fences, fixing machinery even after the years had worn on him. It was where Bradley had learned the hard lessons of life, of patience, perseverance, and the unspoken love between a father and a son. Now the barn was a shadow of what it had been, a cold, empty space filled with memories of a life long gone. Bradley crouched down next to a rusted tool chest, running his fingers over the metal. He could almost hear the hum of his father's voice in the back of his mind, telling him to work hard to take care of what was his, to never let the storm win. He could see Tom now standing just a few feet away, his hands rough from years of labor, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked. He could hear the faintest hint of his father's laughter, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It had been 10 years since the accident. 10 years of living in the aftermath of that day of the phone call, the shock, the grief. 10 years of trying to fill the void that had opened up inside him and never quite succeeding. Bradley stood up, shaking off the memory. He couldn't afford to linger on it. He had a mission now. And Canyon, as always, was by his side, his body tense, his eyes scanning the room. The dog had never stopped being a soldier, even in retirement. His instincts were too sharp, his duty too ingrained. Just checking the roof, Bradley muttered more to himself than to Canyon. The wind howled outside, and Bradley felt it in his chest, a gnawing ache that wouldn't let him go. As they made their way around the barn, securing what they could, the storm continued to pick up in intensity. By the time they finished, the snow had begun to fall in thick, blinding sheets, erasing the world outside. They retreated to the house, but Bradley couldn't settle. The house groaned under the pressure of the wind, the weight of the storm pressing down on every corner, every wall. He collapsed into a chair, but his mind wouldn't quiet. Canyon lay down at his feet, but Bradley couldn't relax. The quiet was unsettling. The silence of the storm outside felt too much like the silence inside him, the silence he had lived with for the past decade. It wasn't long before he heard it, the sound that would shatter the calm. A deep groan, the sound of tortured wood, followed by a muffled thump that vibrated through the floor. Canyon was on his feet before Bradley had even registered the noise, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's body was coiled tight, his ears flat against his head, his stance alert. Bradley's mind snapped into focus. "What was that?" he muttered, his voice rough from the tension that had already settled in his chest. He grabbed the heavy flashlight by the door and pushed himself up his body, moving on autopilot as he walked toward the source of the sound. The old barn. The barn that had stood for decades. The barn that now was no longer standing. The air outside had turned bitter, the storm howling with a ferocity that made the windows rattle. Bradley stood in the doorway, his hand still gripping the flashlight, staring at the wreckage that had once been the barn. He had seen a lot in his time, battlefields broken, men destruction, but this was different. This felt like the last piece of his past being torn away. The barn's roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow, the once proud structure now little more than a heap of twisted metal and splintered wood. It wasn't just the loss of the building, it was what it represented. This was his father's legacy, the place where Tom had spent countless hours, the place that had held their shared history. And now it was gone, erased. "No." Bradley whispered the word, barely audible over the shriek of the wind. His breath fogged in the cold air, but it felt like nothing in comparison to the cold knot that had settled in his stomach. Canyon stood next to him, stiff and alert, his nose twitching in the frozen air. The dog's body was low to the ground, his ears pinned, forward eyes fixed on something just beyond the wreckage. "What is it, Boy Bradley?" muttered his voice, rough. He moved toward the barn, Canyon following closely behind, but the dog didn't budge from his position. He stood at the edge of the wreckage, nose to the ground, his body quivering with a nervous energy Bradley hadn't seen in years. Bradley felt a sudden prickling on the back of his neck, the sense that something was wrong in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the destruction. It wasn't just the storm. It was something more, something that hadn't clicked into place yet, but that Bradley could feel in his gut. Canyon whined a low, strained sound that was more than just discomfort. Bradley knelt beside him, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The dog's nose twitched as he sniffed the air, his movements slow and deliberate as if following an unseen trail. "What is it?" Canyon Bradley muttered. The dog had always been sharp, always sensing things before they happened, and Bradley trusted him more than anyone. If Canyon was reacting like this, it meant there was something Bradley couldn't see, something hidden beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple disaster. The dog took a few cautious steps forward, his paws crunching in the snow as he moved closer to the collapsed roof. Bradley followed, trying to make sense of the situation. They were still within the perimeter of the barn, and the snow was too deep to make any real progress. But Canyon's nose was relentless, his sniffing growing more intense, his ears flicking back in agitation. Bradley took a deep breath and followed the dog, his boots sinking deeper into the snow with each step. He had been here countless times before, walking the same path, checking the same lines, but this time felt different. Every instinct in him screamed that something was out of place. The world had been thrown off balance, and Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't control. As they neared the wreckage, Canyon suddenly stopped. He raised his head and sniffed the air, the low growl building deep in his chest. The noise was more than just a warning. It was a declaration. There was something in the air, something Bradley couldn't smell, but Canyon had picked up on it immediately. "What is it, boy?" Bradley asked, his voice tense. His mind raced, jumping to conclusions, but he pushed them aside. His gut told him this was no ordinary day on the ranch. There was something here, something Bradley needed to uncover. Canyon lowered his head again, his body coiled tight with focus. Bradley followed his lead eyes, scanning the ground around the barn, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But it wasn't until Canyon nudged the ground with his nose that Bradley's attention shifted. The dog's movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Bradley could see it. The ground wasn't just soft from the thaw. There was something beneath the surface, something that didn't belong. "What's this?" Bradley muttered to himself, kneeling down to inspect the spot Canyon had uncovered. He felt a sharp pang in his chest as his fingers brushed the frozen earth. Something cold, something solid. He dug with his hands, pulling away clumps of snow and debris, and then he hit something. A distinct, hard object buried just beneath the surface. Canyon barked once, a sharp, demanding sound that made Bradley's heart race. It wasn't just a call for attention, it was an alert. Something was happening. Something was shifting. Bradley didn't hesitate. He dug faster, the chill of the snow biting into his skin as he pulled the object free. It came loose with a heavy sucking sound, and Bradley's heart skipped a beat as he held it up, a large black waterproof case. A pelican case. Military grade. Covered in mud, but otherwise undamaged. "What the hell?" Bradley whispered, his breath coming in short bursts as he wiped the muck off the case. Canyon stood at his side, watching with an intensity Bradley hadn't seen in years. The dog's eyes were locked on the object, his ears flicking back as if he could sense the gravity of the situation. Bradley's hands trembled as he studied the case. It was clearly out of place. It didn't belong here. The ranch wasn't the kind of place where people left behind military-grade gear, and yet here it was. Buried under a collapsed barn, hidden beneath snow and debris. His gut told him it was important, that it wasn't a coincidence. He stood holding the case with a sense of urgency. Canyon sat back on his haunches, his eyes unwavering, still as a stone. Bradley turned and walked toward the house without a word, the cold pressing against his skin, but it was nothing compared to the knot in his stomach. Something was unfolding, something that had been buried for far too long. Inside the kitchen, the warmth of the fire hit him like a wall. The heat felt wrong against his skin, too much of a contrast to the freezing cold that had enveloped him outside. He placed the pelican case on the kitchen table, and Canyon immediately sat beside it, refusing to leave its side. The dog was alert, still watching his gaze, never leaving the black case. Bradley took a deep breath and wiped the remaining snow and mud off the clasps, his hands still trembling with a mix of cold and fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside this case would change everything. He didn't know how or why, but it was a feeling that had settled deep in his gut. The kitchen was too warm, too quiet. The fire crackled softly in the corner, but all Bradley could hear was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. His fingers hesitated as they brushed over the clasps. The sound of Canyon's low growl was the only thing that grounded him in the moment. He had been living with questions for so long, questions that had never been answered, and now it felt like he was on the edge of discovering something he had never even dared to imagine. He flipped the clasps, opened the seal, breaking with a faint hiss of air. The moment the case opened, a wave of cold air flooded out, and Bradley's eyes locked on the contents. A satellite phone, a rolled-up topographical map, and a shock-proof hard drive. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at the hard drive. This was no ordinary find. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Bradley sat still, staring at the contents of the Pelican case, laid out before him a satellite phone, a rolled-up topographical map, and the solid-state drive still wrapped in a layer of dirt. His breath came out in short bursts, his mind racing with the implications. It felt as if the world had just tilted on its axis, pulling him into a direction he didn't want to go but had no choice but to follow. Canyon sat beside him, his body taut, his eyes fixed on the items in front of them. Bradley ran a hand over the smooth surface of the hard drive, the inscription on the bottom catching his eye. His fingers shook as he turned it over, the laser-etched words standing out in stark contrast to the muddy exterior. Solitude Creek coordinates, 1,998, he whispered, barely able to breathe. The year, the location, his father's handwriting, the words he had written for him when Bradley was just a child. He could remember the warmth of the day, standing beside his father on the banks of the Salmon River, learning how to cast his first fly rod. The memory seemed distant now, as if it belonged to another life, but it was clear. It was their spot. Their place. A spot that had meant something sacred between them. Why was it written on this? Bradley quickly unplugged the hard drive from his computer, impatient for answers. His eyes were wild with urgency as he opened the file labeled Redmi MP4. As the screen flickered and a grainy video began to play, Bradley's breath caught in his throat. His father's face filled the screen, but it wasn't the man he remembered, the vibrant, confident Tom. This version of him was older, wearier, his face etched with stress and worry. Bradley. Tom's voice crackled through the speaker, raspy, urgent. His father's gaze was steady, though his eyes were filled with something Bradley had never seen before, fear. If you're watching this, it means I'm dead. Tom continued, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry, son. I had to protect you. I had to let you go. The most important thing was your safety. Tom's face twisted in grief as the words left his mouth. Bradley's mind spun as he stared at the screen. This wasn't just a final message. This was a warning. He's alive. How was that possible? How could his father have been hiding all this time, pretending to be dead? Tom went on, his words growing more desperate. This box is a failsafe, a dead man's switch. My system is set to send you an encrypted message with the location of this box if I miss my 72-hour check-in. If you're seeing this, my check-in has been missed. It means they found me. Bradley's stomach tightened as the full weight of his father's words crashed over him. Who found him? And why hadn't he known? Why hadn't Tom trusted him enough to let him in on whatever was going on? Whatever had driven his father to disappear? Tom continued, his eyes wide with urgency. This drive contains everything. Everything on Project Nightshade. Everything on a man named Malcolm. He's the director of Ares Global Solutions. The man who forced my hand. This is the evidence. Bradley's fingers trembled on the mouse, clicking to pause the video. Project Nightshade. The name rang a bell, a vague echo of something Bradley couldn't quite place. But the name Malcolm made his heart sink. He remembered whispers in the corridors, hushed conversations when his father had been involved with federal investigations. The FBI had been following Ares Global Solutions for years. But what did his father know about them that was worth hiding for a decade? The video continued, but Bradley's focus was already elsewhere. Tom's voice came through again, more strained this time. Listen to me, Bradley. This is my last request. Take this drive, take the map, and go to Agent Teresa Vaughn. Her number is on the sat phone. She's the only one I trust. Give her everything. Do not look for me. Do not investigate. It's too late for me. Live your life, son. That's all I ever wanted. I love you. The video ended abruptly, the last frame showing Tom's face frozen in that familiar expression, a mix of sorrow and love that Bradley had seen 1,000 times before. For a moment, the room was silent except for Canyon's low whine, his nose nudging at Bradley's leg as if trying to ground him. His head was cocked, his eyes full of questions. Bradley didn't move. He couldn't. His mind was still trying to process what had just unfolded. What had his father done? What was he protecting him from? And most pressing of all, why had Tom gone to such extremes to hide from him for 10 years? The memory of that day was still too sharp, too raw for Bradley to revisit without a twinge of pain. It was one of the last days before the accident when his father had been packing for another trip to the ranch. They'd spoken on the phone just hours before the storm hit. Tom had been unusually quiet, distracted even, but Bradley had chalked it up to his usual pre-trip business. It had been a perfect morning, clear skies, the scent of pine hanging in the air, the river running smooth beneath the early autumn Sunday. They'd planned to fish together like they used to, but that had never happened. The call came late in the afternoon, a sudden, urgent message that Bradley had been summoned back to base. Tom had slipped, fallen from the cliff, and the storm had kept rescuers from reaching him in time. That was what they told him. But it had never felt right. The investigation had never added up. The phone call, the conflicting reports, the lack of details, all of it had been swept under the rug too quickly, too neatly. And yet Bradley had been so lost in his grief that he hadn't questioned it. He had buried himself in his deployment, in the work and the daily grind of war, convincing himself that the pain would eventually fade. But it never had. Back in the present, Bradley snapped out of the memory as his phone buzzed on the table. His eyes snapped to it, but it wasn't an incoming message. It was an email. His fingers hesitated before he clicked it open. The subject line read, "Check-in missed, Solitude Creek coordinates." He didn't wait for the email to load completely. His heart pounded as his fingers moved with precision, flipping through the details. There it was, the coordinates. Solitude Creek coordinates 1998. The year the ranch had been purchased. The year his father had bought this place and made it home. It had always been the anchor that tied their family together. But now it felt like the last clue in a puzzle Bradley wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Canyon, sensing the sudden shift in his partner's energy, rose from his place beside Bradley and padded to the window. His ears flicked forward, his body low, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog had a way of sensing danger long before it arrived. Bradley stood moving toward the window, his mind still reeling. The storm outside was relentless, but beyond that, the sense of urgency that had been gnawing at him was now a tangible force. His father's last words echoed in his mind, "Do not investigate." But Bradley had never been good at following orders when it came to the people he loved. And now, with the weight of everything crashing down on him, he realized one thing: there was no going back. He grabbed the satellite phone from the table, plugged it into the wall charger, and checked the remaining contents of the case. The topographical map, the hard drive, everything pointed to a single conclusion. Whatever his father had been running from, it was far from over. He looked down at Canyon. The dog's body was still his gaze, steady. "It's time to go, boy." Canyon's ears perked. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. He simply moved to the door, waiting for Bradley to lead the way. The wind outside screamed like an animal, tearing through the pines and driving the snow in fierce gusts, yet inside the house everything had fallen unnervingly silent. The fire crackled in the corner of the room, but Bradley barely noticed it. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the haunting truth that had just been revealed. His father, the man he had thought dead for a decade, was alive. But he wasn't living. He was hiding, hunted by a man named Malcolm, and an entire clandestine operation. Bradley turned the satellite phone over in his hand, the green indicator light blinking steadily. He had just made contact with Agent Teresa Vaughn, the one person his father had trusted, but Vaughn was 3 hours away and they didn't have that much time. Bradley knew they had to move fast. Canyon sat quietly at his side, his body tense, ready for whatever came next. The bond between them had always been unspoken, built on years of mutual understanding. Canyon wasn't just a dog. He was a partner. And now, as always, he was Bradley's anchor in the storm. Without a word, Bradley grabbed his jacket and pulled it over his shoulders, moving with practiced efficiency. He didn't look at the photograph of his father on the mantel, didn't even glance at the broken picture frame that had stood on the shelf for years, a reminder of the man he had lost. His father's words, the ones he had heard in the video, echoed in his mind. "Do not investigate. It's too late for me." Bradley had never been good at following orders, especially not when it came to the people he loved. And now, with the bitter taste of betrayal in his mouth, the need to uncover the truth to find his father was all-consuming. "We're not waiting anymore, boy," Bradley muttered, his voice rough with the weight of his decisions. Canyon's tail gave a single purposeful thump, as if in agreement. Bradley moved toward the door, opening it with a creak. The cold air hit him like a slap, sharp and biting. The storm outside had escalated, the snow swirling in angry whirls as it battered the ranch. The pickup truck sat waiting at the end of the long driveway, the engine complaining as it struggled to stay warm. Bradley's hand hovered over the keys for a moment before he turned his attention back to Canyon. "Stay close," he said softly. The dog's eyes met his unwavering. No command was needed. They were a team. The truck bounced and creaked as it fought its way up the winding Forest Service road tires, spinning in the deep snow. Bradley's knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel, the icy landscape flashing past in a blur of white and gray. The storm was relentless, but he barely noticed it. The closer they got to Cougar's Fang, the more his pulse quickened. Canyon sat in the passenger seat, his body rigid with alertness. The dog had never been more still, his eyes fixed out the window nose, twitching as he sniffed the air. Bradley kept glancing over at him, but Canyon never wavered. He was locked onto something, his senses sharp, his instincts telling him that the path ahead was fraught with danger. They reached the point where the road turned impassable, the snow too deep for the truck to continue. Bradley stopped the vehicle, flicking it into park, with a calm precision. "Looks like we're on foot from here," Bradley muttered to Canyon, though it was more of an observation than a question. Canyon didn't respond. He didn't need to. The world outside the truck was a blinding, unrelenting sheet of white. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature had dropped even further, biting at their skin with an intensity that made Bradley's bones ache. But this wasn't new to him. He had walked through worse. The terrain was brutal, and every step felt like a battle. The snow was deep, often up to his knees, and the wind tried to force him off course, making every movement a fight. But Bradley moved with purpose, his mind focused, his body moving on autopilot. This was nothing compared to the battlefields he had left behind, but the urgency in his chest, the fear for his father, pushed him forward with a relentlessness that kept him going. Canyon led the way, his paws barely making a sound on the fresh powder. The dog's movements were calculated, each step deliberate. Bradley trusted him implicitly. Canyon wasn't just a dog. He was the only reason Bradley had managed to hold onto any semblance of sanity these last 5 years. And now, Canyon was guiding him through the storm, leading him toward the truth. After hours of battling the storm, they finally reached the base of Cougar's Fang. The wind here was a weapon funneled through the narrow crevices of the rock, a shrieking, high-pitched whistle that made Bradley's blood run cold. The sound was familiar, like a mortar, whistling through the air, just before the world exploded. Bradley stopped dead in his tracks. His heart raced, his body locked in place. The memory hit him like a wave, a flashback to Ramadi, the air thick with dust and gunpowder, the world breaking apart around him. He froze his body, remembering the fear, the chaos, the weight of the world in that moment. Canyon stopped beside him, his body pressed close to Bradley's, his presence steady and grounding. The dog's low whine vibrated in Bradley's chest, a sound of understanding. He wasn't alone. He wasn't back on that rooftop. Bradley blinked, shaking his head, and took a deep breath. The past was still there, lurking in the edges of his consciousness, but it wasn't going to stop him now. He couldn't let it. "This is it," Bradley muttered, his voice, rough but determined. The granite cliffs loomed ahead, towering like silent sentinels. Canyon's ears flicked forward as he moved toward the base of the cliff, his body moving with the quiet grace of a predator. Bradley followed his eyes, scanning the landscape for any signs of danger. The storm had cleared the path, but it had also made it treacherous. The ice-slicked rock was as dangerous as it was beautiful, and Bradley knew it wasn't going to be easy. But Canyon had already found the way. The dog darted forward, his nose, twitching, as he moved toward a narrow, man-made path hidden behind a thicket of snow-covered pines. It was barely visible, almost camouflaged by the snow, but it was there. Canyon had found it as he always did. Bradley followed the path, winding upwards toward the sheer granite face. The entrance to the hidden bunker behind Cougar's Fang was somewhere ahead, hidden from view. "Good boy, Canyon Bradley," whispered, his voice filled with a deep sense of gratitude. Canyon gave him a quick glance, ears perked before continuing to lead the way. As they reached the top of the climb, the hidden entrance appeared, the reinforced steel door set into the rock painted to match the surrounding granite. Bradley's heart pounded as he approached it, the door slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been. Nothing about this place should have been open, but it was. He took a step forward, and Canyon stopped beside him, his body rigid with alertness. Bradley's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment that everything had been leading to. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges barely audible over the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, recent, fresh, and unmistakable. The hairs on the back of Bradley's neck stood up as he stepped into the darkened room, his pistol drawn and ready. The room was not a rustic cabin as he had expected. It was a high-tech bunker filled with computer servers, maps, and a pile of brass casings littering the floor. His father had been here, and he had fought. A flash of movement caught Bradley's attention. A man stepped out of the shadows, a rifle trained on him. "Don't move," the man's voice was low and gravelly tinged with panic. Canyon growled, his body crouching, ready to strike. Bradley's mind raced, his hand tightening around his pistol. The man's face was familiar, old, disheveled, but recognizable. The memory clicked, and the name came to him, Felix. Felix, Bradley said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "What the hell are you doing here? I'm sorry, Bradley. I had to help him," Felix said, his voice shaking as he lowered the rifle, his eyes wide with fear and recognition. Bradley's gaze narrowed. His father had been hiding here, and Felix had been involved. But there was more to this story than just betrayal. We need to move. Felix said, his voice urgent now. He's not dead, Bradley. He's out there, and he's hurt, and they're coming for him. Bradley's heart stopped. His mind snapped into focus. Tom wasn't dead. The silence that followed Felix's words felt suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity. Bradley stood frozen, his hand, still gripping his pistol, eyes locked on Felix's frantic, wild gaze. His mind was still reeling from the video, from the shock of learning his father had been alive all this time, but now there was something else, something more immediate. His father was out there wounded, and the people who had hunted him for years were coming for him again. The storm raged outside, but inside the bunker it was eerily still. The hum of the servers, the faint crackling of old equipment, it was all there, a harsh reminder of the mission his father had been running from. Bradley's heart thudded in his chest, his thoughts tumbling over each other. Felix's voice, shaky and urgent, finally broke the silence. He's hurt, Bradley. He's not dead, he's just out there and they found him. We have to move fast. Felix's words snapped Bradley back into the present. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. His gaze flicked to the satellite phone on the table, the small green light blinking steadily. Teresa Vaughn had been his contact, his father's last trusted ally, but now it was up to him. He had to find Tom before the enemy did. Where did he go? Bradley asked, his voice, low, calm, cold with purpose. Felix swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the back of the bunker, where a narrow door led to a dark tunnel. The door was slightly ajar, and Bradley could see the faint trace of blood on the floor, a stark red against the concrete. He went out that way, Felix said, his voice barely above a whisper, a mixture of guilt and fear. He was bleeding. He's hurt bad. Bradley's mind snapped into focus, every muscle in his body tensing. The reality was clear now. Tom had been fighting back. This wasn't a simple disappearance or accident. This had been a battle, a fight for survival. Bradley's hand shifted from his gun to the map on the desk. His fingers brushed over the topographical lines, feeling the contours of the landscape. The map was marked with an X in the middle of nowhere, but that was where Tom had gone, Raven's Perch. The place that had meant something to them both, a childhood memory, a quiet spot in the wilderness where they had spent hours fishing, talking, and just being together. That place, Raven's Perch, was no longer a retreat. It was the last place Tom would go to hide, and it was the place the enemy would never expect. But it was also the place that could cost Tom his life. We're not waiting for anyone, Bradley said, his voice low and firm. We move now. He turned to Canyon, who was already pacing by the door, ears perked ready. Bradley could feel the shift in the air. Canyon was no longer the confused dog he had been in the house. He was back to being a working dog, a military asset. Canyon was ready. Bradley grabbed his pack, slinging it over his shoulder with swift efficiency. He didn't need to think. Everything was automatic now. The gear, the planning, the execution. It was as if he had never left that world. The world of clear orders and clean lines. The world where every decision had weight and every second counted. Felix grabbed his own rifle, but his hands were shaking. He looked at Bradley, his face drawn with fear and uncertainty. I'll help, but you need to understand something. Bradley turned to him, his gaze hard and steady. I'm not waiting for anyone, Felix. Not for Vaughn. Not for anybody. If your father's out there, we need to move now. Felix nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. I get it. Let's go. Outside, the storm had only worsened. The truck had been left behind. The snow had piled high, making it impossible to drive. The only way forward was on foot, and Bradley was determined not to waste a second. The terrain was unforgiving. The snow was deep and heavy, and the wind sliced through the trees with a shrill, cutting howl. Every step felt like a battle against nature itself, but Bradley didn't falter. Canyon led the way, his paws moving with a quiet determination. The dog knew where they were going. He knew the scent of Tom, the trail that led them onward. They moved in silence, the only sounds the crunch of boots in the snow, and Canyon's soft footfalls until they reached the base of the steep incline leading to Raven's Perch. The old fire lookout sat perched high above them, its silhouette barely visible through the haze of snow. Bradley's heart thudded in his chest. The climb would be brutal, but they had no choice. Tom was out there, and they had to reach him before the enemy did. Felix, though, older, kept pace, his breath coming in labored bursts. He was slowing down, but he didn't complain. He couldn't afford to. The stakes were too high. The sense of urgency had permeated everything, the very air they breathed. Time was running out. The path up the ridge was narrow, slick with ice. Bradley could hear the faint rustling of wind as it whipped through the trees, the snow stinging his face. He focused on Canyon, who was already ahead, moving sure-footed despite the slick terrain. The dog's instincts had always been sharp, and now they were the difference between life and death. As they neared the top, Bradley's heart skipped a beat. There, silhouetted against the pale light, was the fire lookout. It was just as they remembered it, an old wooden structure, creaky and abandoned, sitting on stilts at the edge of the ridge, a place frozen in time. But something was wrong. The wind had kicked up the storm, swirling with an intensity that seemed unnatural. And Canyon had stopped in his tracks, his body low, his tail flicking nervously. Bradley froze, his instincts kicking in. Something's wrong. He scanned the area, his eyes darting from one dark corner to another. Canyon, he whispered, his voice strained. The dog moved toward the base of the lookout, sniffing the air. A low growl started in Canyon's throat, the tension palpable. Bradley followed, but his gaze never left the silhouette of the lookout. This wasn't the place it used to be. The old memories of fishing, of simple days spent with his father, had been replaced with something darker. They were close now. So close. Felix, breathing heavily, came up behind them. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice sharp with worry. "Stay close," Bradley ordered. "We don't know who's out there." Bradley could see it now, the faint glint of light reflecting off something metal, a figure cloaked by the storm moving swiftly and quietly. But it wasn't Tom. Bradley's pulse spiked. "Cross," he muttered under his breath. The hunter was already here. Bradley's mind clicked into combat mode, every detail falling into place. Cross. The man who had been hunting Tom for years. The enforcer for Ares Global Solutions. This wasn't just about finding Tom anymore. This was about stopping the hunter before he could finish what he had started. Bradley pulled his rifle from his pack, checking the action with quick, precise movements. Canyon's body had gone rigid beside him, the dog's eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape, his body coiled tight, ready to spring. Felix was slower to react, but Bradley didn't have time to wait. He moved first. With a swift command, Canyon darted forward, his sleek body cutting through the snow with practiced ease. Bradley followed, staying low, his rifle at the ready. They were a team, silent, efficient, deadly. The storm had intensified the snow now, swirling in thick sheets. Visibility was low, but Bradley's focus was razor-sharp. He had one target, Cross, and he wasn't going to let him take his father again. Suddenly, a flash of movement, Canyon's body lunged, and the hunter's scream rang through the storm. The man was caught off guard, the rifle knocked from his hands in a brutal, calculated strike. Bradley didn't hesitate. He fired twice, each shot landing true. Cross crumpled to the ground, his body a heap of limp flesh. Canyon stood over him, the dog's breathing heavy, his body poised. Bradley could feel the bond between them stronger now than ever before. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Canyon's tail thumped once, then went still. But even as the adrenaline began to wear off, Bradley knew this wasn't over. His father was still out there, and they had a mission to complete. "Let's go," Bradley said, his voice steady, now filled with purpose. The wind had begun to quiet as Bradley and Canyon approached the fire lookout. The storm still raged in fits and bursts, but the worst of it was behind them. The air felt different now, colder, sharper, but not in the way it had felt before. This was a new kind of silence, one that came with purpose. Felix had fallen behind his breath, coming in ragged gasps, but Bradley barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the lookout, the small structure that seemed more like a monument to the past than a place of refuge. They were close now. So close to Tom, to the man he had thought lost forever. As they reached the base of the lookout, Canyon stopped in his tracks again, ears flicking forward, nostrils flaring. Bradley, sensing something was off, took a cautious step forward. A faint scraping sound, the weight of a body moving inside the lookout, made his heart race. "Tom?" Bradley called, his voice hoarse with urgency. The door to the lookout creaked open slowly, and then there he was, Tom, his father. Weak, pale, and covered in blood, but alive. Tom's eyes flicked toward him, recognition flashing across his face, a flicker of relief mingled with something else, something darker. He was clutching a small black hard drive in his hand, his left leg propped up with a makeshift tourniquet that was soaked with blood. "Bradley." Tom's voice was weak, ragged. He shifted, trying to sit up, but winced in pain. Bradley rushed to his father's side, falling to his knees beside him. "You're not dead," he whispered, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Tom smiled weakly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't think I'd make it this far." His voice was cracked hoarse. "Didn't think anyone would come." Bradley shook his head, disbelief still hanging in the air. "You should have told me, old man," he muttered, his hand gripping his father's as if to steady himself. "You shouldn't have left me like that." Tom's eyes softened, and for a moment the storm outside seemed to fade away. "I did it to protect you, Bradley," he said, his voice strained. You have no idea what's at stake." Bradley looked at his father, his heart thumping in his chest, a mixture of anger and relief flooding his veins. He's here. He's alive. He's been hiding all this time. He swallowed hard, trying to keep the flood of emotion at bay. You think this is protecting me? You left me alone for 10 years and you think you were protecting me. Tom winced, but then met Bradley's eyes with a quiet, knowing look. I wasn't protecting you from the world, son. I was protecting you from me. Bradley looked away, the weight of the words heavy on his chest. Protecting me from him. He thought about the last 10 years, the nightmares, the feeling of being abandoned, of having nothing left but this ranch, this dog, and a life that had been carved into him by grief. The world he had created for himself had been one of silence, a silence filled with echoes of his father's absence. But as he looked at Tom now sitting on the floor of the lookout, bloodied and broken, Bradley knew the truth. His father had carried the burden of secrets for far too long. He had kept the truth locked away, a truth that could have killed them both. And yet here they were. Here in the middle of this frozen wilderness, their lives forever altered by a single decision. A decision Tom had made years ago to protect the very son who had always loved him. I'm not angry anymore, Dad, Bradley said finally, his voice low, full of exhaustion and something else. He gently squeezed his father's hand. I'm just tired. Tom nodded as if he understood. The truth had come at a high price, but Bradley knew they still had time. Time to rebuild, time to heal. The sound of helicopter blades in the distance broke the stillness. The distant hum echoed in the cold air, growing louder by the second. Bradley's head snapped up. He looked toward the sound. Agent Teresa Vaughn's team was here. The storm had taken its toll, but it had passed. Tom was alive. Canyon had done his job. And now, for the first time in years, Bradley allowed himself to feel the smallest flicker of hope. He stood up, pulling Tom to his feet with the help of the old wooden beam inside the lookout. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how long the ghosts of the past would haunt him. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. He looked down at Canyon, who stood at his side, his body still aching from the last fight, but standing as firm and steady as ever. The dog's presence was a constant, an anchor, a reminder that even in the darkest of times there was always a path forward. We'll get through this, Boy Bradley whispered to Canyon, his voice rough but resolute. The dog's tail thumped, once a sound of quiet understanding. Then together the three of them turned to face the horizon, the future, ahead of them uncertain but free. And as the helicopter descended, the doors opened to a world of unknowns. Bradley couldn't help but feel the weight lift from his shoulders. The hunt was over. The ghosts of the past were finally fading. The future was his to claim. For the first time in 10 years, Bradley took a deep breath, filled with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. END. This final section ties up the major narrative threads, giving Bradley and his father a chance at redemption and healing while leaving the door open for future possibilities. The end is poignant, grounded in the emotional journey of the characters, and emphasizes the theme of healing through loyalty and understanding. Let me know your thoughts.